The 45 Home Lab is an awesome home and small business server, but today, we're going to make it even better. This box has been up there the whole time.
Alright everyone, our customers have spoken. I'm hearing they're no longer satisfied with normal intelligence. So instead, we need to jump right on to the next big thing, and that of course is...
Artificial intelligence?
What? No, everyone uses AI. We need something bigger, something better. We need to jump straight to... ludicrous intelligence.
What if we just used actual intelligence and went with Vultr? We can run our services in the cloud. They've got options for virtualized or bare metal instances, even HPC or GPU compute for AI accelerated workloads.
What about storage?
Yep, SSD-backed object and block storage plans.
Easy deployments?
Over 100 one-click installs for common services.
Well then, what are we all standing around here for?
Well, I did say this meeting probably could have been an email. Vultr is the everywhere cloud, with 32 locations worldwide, allowing you to host apps and services no matter where you or your customers live. And with more than 100 one-click installers, you'll be able to get your OS and services up and running in no time. From managed WordPress solutions, to gaming hosts, and even full NVIDIA GPU stacks for AI-driven businesses, all without the cost or complexity of hyperscalers. Visit vultr.com/craft and get a $300 credit to your account just for signing up. Again, that's vultr.com/craft, and a huge thanks to Vultr for sponsoring today's video. Welcome back to Craft Computing, everyone. As always, I'm Jeff. It was right around a month ago that I showed off 45Drives' all-new 45 Home Lab HL8, a desktop NAS server with 8 hot swap drive bays, room for an ITX motherboard, all in a very well-built and compact desktop package. But what I showed off was their pre-built version with a Ryzen 5500 GT 6-core CPU. It is a fantastic CPU for a home or small business server, but in my book, overkill is always underrated. What if you really like the HL8 chassis, but you're craving more power? More power is exactly what we're after today. As soon as I heard 45Drives was ready to start testing the HL8, I reached out to Minisforum because I knew exactly which motherboard I wanted to use. And before we get into it, thanks to Minisforum and Patriot for sending over parts for today's build. Standard disclosure, no money changed hands, and none of the companies involved today get any input over the production of this video. On the table next to me is the Minisforum BD790i, and if you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know why I'm absolutely enamored with this board. Rather than using a desktop CPU socket, this has an AMD mobile CPU soldered directly to the motherboard. And in this case, it's an AMD Ryzen 9 7945HX. This CPU is insane, with a full 16 cores and 32 threads of Zen 4 goodness. And unlike the Earring motherboards that I've looked at in the past with Intel engineering samples bolted on, this is fully sanctioned and supported by AMD, so there's no BIOS funkiness or TDP workarounds to worry about. On their desktop side of things, AMD does have the Ryzen 7950X 16-core CPU, a 170-watt monster when it comes to both gaming and productivity. But cooling 170 watts worth of CPU in an ITX enclosure is hard enough, even when you have room for giant tower coolers or an AIO radiator. We don't have that luxury in the HL8, so high-power parts like that are going to be out of the equation. The Ryzen Mobile 7945HX uses the exact same 8-core CPU chiplets as its desktop cousin, but with a configurable TDP range of just 55 to 75 watts. That's more than 100 watts less than its desktop counterpart. And the Minisforum BD790i includes a low-profile heatsink to keep this beast under control. The only thing you'll need to provide is a 120mm fan to strap on the top of it. What's doubly crazy is the price. See, the BD790i is a fully featured ITX motherboard. Not only does it come with the 7945HX APU and matching heatsink, it's also got a full PCI Express Gen 5x16 desktop expansion slot, a pair of Gen 5x4 M.2 slots for NVMe, along with a 2.5 gigabit network port built right in. You get all of that for $539. That's just $60 more than the desktop 7950X CPU. No motherboard, no cooler, just the CPU. For memory, Patriot was kind enough to send over a 64GB pit of DDR5-5600 for this build. It's a nice balance of high capacity and speed that should be a perfect match for our Zen 4 CPU. But of course, there's a problem using this motherboard in a NAS server. There are exactly 0 SATA ports on board. Now, the easiest solution would have been to grab an LSI, SATA, or SAS controller and stick it into the PCI Express X16 slot. But I wanted that slot for GPU expansion. So I had to come up with a, shall we say, less conventional solution. In fact, this is one of the most cursed PC parts I've ever come across, and I absolutely love it. This is the IOCrest IO M2F588-8i, and it's an M.2 8-port SATA controller. Let me say that part again. It's an M.2 PCI Express card with a pair of SFF 8087 ports and 2 independent SATA controllers on board. It's tiny and adorable, and I absolutely didn't believe this actually existed until I opened the box. Now, of course, I'm not the only one who has ever tried to solve the 8 SATA ports in an ITX box problem before. 45Drives themselves wanted to solve this because, well, they built the HL8. They actually experimented with this exact SATA controller, but opted not to use it because hot swap is not supported. If you want to use this card, that means if you ever have a drive failure, you will need to shut down the system and remove and replace that particular drive. That's obviously a less than stellar solution, especially if you're 45Drives and need to support the hardware and software that you're selling. But someone like me who understands what they're doing and can deal with a little bit of downtime every once in a while, this is an absolute banger of a solution. There's also an upside to using this card, as all 8 drives are on a single controller, which was actually a requirement for me as the BD790i, again, doesn't have a single SATA port itself. Also, for server installs, the IOCrest makes pass-through easier if you plan on virtualizing your NAS inside of a VM, as all 8 disks are off of this single controller. Now, as for other devices, I mentioned in the first video there's a new value king for video encoding acceleration, and it's the Intel Arc A310. This one is from Sparkle, and it is a perfect fit for the HL8 in a half-height full-length card. I plan on passing through this GPU to a Plex virtual machine to test it out, though I'd eventually like to test out making SRIOV function and support multiple VMs, though I will likely need to reach out to Wendell and see how that's going on Intel consumer cards, as SRIOV is not officially supported on this card, but I hear you can flash this over to a Flex 170. Now, the idea for this build is an all-in-one home lab or small business server. Lots of storage, lots of capacity for VMs. My preferred way to make that happen is running Proxmox on the host and then virtualizing TrueNAS to manage the storage pool. But this time around, I'm actually going to flip the script and run TrueNAS as the main OS, managing both storage and virtual machines on the same install. While I won't have enough slots in the server for dedicated NVMe storage for the virtual machines, with 8 spinning disks, VM storage should still be plenty fast. Plus, I've been looking for an excuse to get a little bit more familiar with TrueNAS as a virtual machine host. The plan for today is to get the server assembled and up and running, and in a follow-up video I'm going to explore managing virtual machines a bit more, including PCI Express pass-through for the A310. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that one. But I think that's all of the introductions out of the way, so let's go ahead and get started. For doing these kinds of builds, sometimes I like a build montage, sometimes I want to do it live, and in this case I wanted to do it live because there's a couple of things about this chassis that you need to keep in mind when putting it all together. First and foremost is probably the drive backplane. So let's go ahead and get this box open and we'll take a look. Now again, if you didn't see the first video on the HL8, I will remind you this is a late stage prototype. There's some features of this case that didn't make the final cut, and the final version is a little bit different. First and foremost, I have a CNC motherboard tray on here. That was for fitting up exactly what they wanted before they finalized the pegs that they were using, and so on and so forth. So you'll see little things like that that definitely aren't final. Now, what is final is the drive cage, the power supply, and the backplane. In my case, I need to get to the backplane because I need to replace the cables that came with mine. What was included are these 8643 SFF SAS ends, and then those break out into 4 SATA plugs each. As my motherboard isn't using SATA, these cables do me no good. So the backplane itself does use these 8643 SAS ends, and it is a full SATA and SAS 12 gig backplane if you have the proper controller. So if drive type is very important to you and you want to use SAS drives, you can totally do that with the backplane that's included. SATA is only supported on the HL8 because of the motherboard and hardware selection, but the drive plane is fully capable of being SAS. So to get to that back plane, first off, we're going to remove the 4 screws in the back holding the power supply in place. That should just lift right out. And if I turn the case towards you, you can see all of these screws on the side here. There are 5 screws on this side and then 2 screws on the bottom, and that will remove the drive cage itself. 4, 5. Tip it on its head here. And 2 more screws right there. Just like that, drive cage is ready to come out. So there you can see the backplane, and right here on the top, I'll go ahead and get a picture of this and overlay it here. There are 2 8643 SAS connections poking straight up. All you have to do is plug your cable ends in there and then send them out to the side so they can plug into your controller, your motherboard, whatever you have. For my particular build, we've got a pair of 8643s going to a pair of 8087 SFF ends. So cables look a little something like that. There's one, and there's 2. Try to do a little bit of cable management here. Try to hide some of these cables down behind the back plane. That's not bad. I think that'll work. So my 2 plugs coming out here. Those are going to plug into the controller right there once the motherboard's installed. So I think that'll work. Cool. Go ahead and get the drive trays back installed. All right, and just like that, we've got our SAS cables all plugged in and ready to go. All right, let's go ahead and set this thing aside and let's move on to the motherboard. So here's that Minisforum BD790i, and as you can see, we need to make a couple changes before we get started. Obviously, there is no fan on top of the heatsink here. They do include a bracket so you can install a 120mm fan. There is no rear I/O panel on this. They do include one, and it's actually up to you to screw it in. So we'll go ahead and get that installed as well. We've also got right here at the top of the motherboard this heatsink that goes over the pair of M.2 sockets. So let me go ahead and get this thing out of the way. Under here are the pair of M.2s. Now these are Gen 5x4 M.2 slots. Both of them run at full speed. Now we're not going to be able to use the giant heatsink on these as, well, obviously my SATA controller needs a little bit of additional space. So we're going to set this one right over here in the top slot. We're going to set the M.2 drive for booting in the second slot, and hopefully, I haven't even tested this yet, hopefully the 120mm fan fits right here, leaving us just enough room to be able to get the SATA cables plugged in. But starting off, let's go ahead and get the rear I/O shield installed on here. We will need to remove the 2 nuts holding the Wi-Fi antenna on here. There we go. Nice tight fit around all the ports. Fortunately, there's not really a great way to film this. So there's the 2 nuts that go over the Wi-Fi antennas, and then there's also 2 little tiny M.2 screws that install right above the 2 display ports. And 2. All right. All right. And there we go. 1 installed rear I/O shield. So next up, we'll go ahead and do our M.2 slots. Now these are kind of cool. They've actually got a server-inspired plastic retention on them. So it's just a little peg that goes into a standoff rather than having an M.2 screw. And I really like this design. I know I think it's Supermicro and Asus use this on some of their server boards. But I really like that. It holds the drives just fine, and it's way easier than trying to find screws. And we'll go ahead and get our cursed SATA adapter in there as well. Boy, that's funky looking. I love it, and I hate it. And the last thing we should need to do is hopefully find out if there's going to be room on here for that 120mm fan. And boy, I think we got lucky. Yeah, that 120mm fan is going to come well clear of our two SAS ports there. We've got more than enough room. Excellent. So just those 4 screws. And we should be ready to mount our Noctua. Nice. Very nice. That is 16 cores of awesome with a SATA controller, a boot drive, 64 gigs of DDR5 memory, and 120mm Noctua fan. Let's get this thing installed. All right, and I have no idea how well I'm going to be able to film this, but we'll definitely see. One problem with the black chassis is it is dark in there. There we go. All right, motherboard should drop right into place. All right, I have no idea which one is port 1, which one is port 2. So let's just go ahead and get this thing plugged in. Okay, I already see something I don't like. Those cables put a lot of leverage on that card. You can twist that. That is not going to be the most durable of solutions long term. If you do end up going with this card, I recommend not opening and closing this box very much. I'll also say if that was a solid screw and standoff instead of the plastic tab mount, this might have already broken. That is a lot of pressure on that M.2 card. But we soldier on. And then down here on the bottom, we've got our front panel connectors. And other than that, there's only 2 other things that I need. One of them is our 8-pin EPS connector. That goes right up here. And then our 24-pin power, which we have on this nice braided extension. All right, minus the hard drives, that's pretty much all there is to it. There's not actually many connections that go to the motherboard in this system. Like I said, we've got 24-pin power, 8-pin EPS power, and our front panel connector, and then the 2 SATA leads. That's it. So now, in theory, this should close up just like that. Plenty of space for the fan to breathe right there. The cables aren't too messy either. And we've got a nice little compact home server with 16 cores and 64 gigs of RAM. How about that? So off camera, I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of zip tie work, make sure all the cables flex the way that they should, and I can open and close the system, hopefully without damaging that M.2 card. Beyond that, I'm going to go ahead and get the drives installed in here. Now, for this video, I'm going to go ahead and install Windows and do just a little bit of benchmark work on this, mainly just run through Cinebench and kind of run it through some basic paces, just to see where the CPU lines up in a couple of different benchmarks. In the next video, like I said, I'm going to be installing TrueNAS. We're going to be going through the system and installing a whole bunch of common virtual machines. So things like Pi-hole and VPN servers and Plex and all the things that you might want to run in a home lab. So for right now, I've got a little bit more work to do, but I'll see you guys in just a couple seconds. Well, Like a lot of projects on this channel where I try to use odd component combinations to create PCs that I feel are greater than the sum of their parts, sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. But let's start with the good first. This Minisforum BD790i. Holy shit, is it fast. For CPU testing, I still like testing with both Cinebench R15 and R23. Now, I know R15 is quite a bit older, and most people have, rightfully so, long since moved on from using it. Toward the end of its life, higher performance CPUs were completing this test before their turbo mode would clock down, leading to inflated scores when trying to judge overall CPU performance. This was especially true of very high core count server CPUs, where they may have 32 cores and a base clock of 2.2 GHz, but a single core turbo of 3.8, where it could spring all of its cores to life for brief glimmers of performance, but then after 30 seconds they would shut themselves off and return to between 2.2 and 2.5 GHz. However, if you can complete the test in less than 30 seconds, you look like you were a world beater. R15 may not be accurate for high-end rendering comparisons anymore, but it does do something extraordinarily well when it comes to home lab and servers. It demonstrates burst performance for multi-threaded workloads. Home lab servers especially don't stay pinned at 100% utilization all of the time. And my use cases in particular tend to be very bursty, where I'll hit the server for a couple of minutes at a time, but that's usually when I'm transferring 100 gigabytes worth of video editing footage onto the server, or encoding a video in Plex. So how does the 7945HX 16-core mobile CPU stack up to the hundreds of CPUs that I've tested over the years? It's 6th. As in, it's the 6th fastest multi-threaded CPU on my chart. While I'm sure AMD's Zen 5 Desktop 9950X would absolutely trounce this thing, the 7945HX still straight up beat the Zen 3 base 5950X 16-core desktop CPU. In fact, the only consumer CPU I have in my chart that is faster than the 7945HX is the 13900K. My top 4 CPUs, all AMD EPYCs with 64 cores and 128 threads. But the crazy thing is, at 5,300 points and only $530 to boot, the 7940X is beating out every model of used Xeon on my chart. First and second gen 32-core EPYC CPUs, the Threadripper 2970WX 24-core, and even my 12-core 7900X3D. If you can live with limited I/O, that is just 2 M.2 slots and a single PCI Express X16, this platform is absolutely dominant as a virtual machine host. Now this is a crazy comparison to make, but hear me out here. Earlier this year, I took a look at AMD's Sienna-based EPYC 8534P. It's a 64-core EPYC CPU based on Zen 4C cores. It is a $5,000 chip designed for highly multi-threaded, low-overhead deployments like web hosting, cloud services, and edge telecom solutions. It managed a multi-threaded score in R15 of 7,641 and a single-threaded score of 114. Meanwhile, this 16-core, 32-thread mobile CPU is able to hit a multi-threaded score of 5,297 and a single-threaded score of 306. Sure, the EPYC 64-core is faster, but it's kind of supposed to be in multi-threaded testing. It also has 128 cores to shred through Cinebench, while the 7945HX is working with just 32 threads. Quite a disadvantage. Yet the Sienna EPYC is only 44% faster in this test. Cinebench R23, by comparison, is a 10-minute stress test and does an excellent job of stressing CPUs well beyond their breaking points, and completely eliminating the 30-second turbo advantage that some higher-clocked CPUs would have. In this case, the 7945HX is able to boost up to 100 watts for brief periods of time. But after around 30 seconds, it does drop down to 75 watts. But it did manage to hold there between 4.1 and 4.3 GHz on all 16 cores. For a little while, anyway. But eventually, heat did start building up inside of the system. After around 3.5 minutes, the CPU started hitting 88 degrees Celsius on the package and around 85 degrees Celsius on each of the individual cores, and began clocking itself down. By the end of the test, it had stabilized at 55 watts and was sitting between 3.2 and 3.6 GHz. Still, not a terrible result. Looking again at the EPYC 8534P, you see the differences in test results when turbo mode is taken out of the equation for longer runs. Here the EPYC notches a multi-threaded score of 55,838 and a single-threaded score of 787. The EPYC 8534P may have a boost clock of 3.1 GHz, but that really didn't come into play during this test. That's only achievable on a couple different cores and only for a brief moment in time, a la that 30-second turbo mode. Realistically, I saw this CPU sit at its base clock of 2.3 GHz for the entire duration of the test. The 7945HX mobile chip is a bit more pedestrian here, scoring 25,772 points in multi-threaded testing and a single-threaded score of 1,848. Here in Cinebench R23, the EPYC is nearly 220% faster, but keep in mind, it's supposed to be. It has 4 times as many threads to work with. If you wanted, you could build a 4-cluster server from these Minisforum BD790i motherboards, complete with 96 GB of memory each, dual NVMe storage, cases, and power supplies, and still have a couple thousand left over versus buying a single EPYC 8534P CPU by itself. I have said a couple times that building servers with used Xeons, used EPYCs, and old enterprise gear is only going to be in vogue for so long, especially as systems like this, with as much performance as we see, for as cheap as the system is, again, this is $530 for CPU, motherboard, and heatsink, becomes more affordable and more ubiquitous. But I promised you some bad from this video too, and I think we all saw this coming, at least I did. That is the IOCrest SATA controller. It either died when I was installing it, or it never worked in the first place. I mentioned during the build that it seemed too thin and flimsy for the SFF8087 connectors. The cables were putting a ton of strain on the card, so much so that you could actually see it flexing when I was closing the case. And M.2 devices aren't exactly known for their resilience, as they use very thin PCBs. This is a device that desperately needs a bit of strengthening if you intend to use it. Even just an aluminum heatsink strapped to the bottom would likely provide enough stiffness for it to survive. But as it sits, I just can't recommend using this in this build. And ultimately, that sucks, because without an 8-port SATA controller, I can't use the Minisforum BD790i board in the HL8. I might install an LSI HBA and forego the GPU for video encoding, but I'm still disappointed by this all the same. That also means I can't exactly use the system the way I wanted to. I wanted to test out PCI Express pass-through and some more advanced virtualization features inside TrueNAS Scale. But without devices to pass through, that doesn't make a lot of sense anymore. If anyone has any suggestions for a SATA, or even better yet, a SAS controller solution that would work on this board, please share it down in the comments below. I'm so close to an awesome complete build here, and it sucks that something like a SATA controller is standing between me and one of the most powerful and compact servers that I have ever put together. But I think that's where we're going to end it for today. Like I said, on projects like this, sometimes I win and sometimes I lose, but I share the results either way because any information that I can give you is still good information to have. If this project broke and I just never published the results, you'd never know if this was a good or a bad solution to look at. Anyway, if you like videos like this, make sure to hit that thumbs up button and subscribe to Craft Computing if you haven't done so already. And if you like the content you see on this channel and want to help support me in buying weird crap like this, head on over to craftcomputing.store and check out some of my merch, or join the Patreon and get access to my exclusive Discord server. And that's going to do it for me in this one. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next video. Cheers, everyone.